In this video, we'll be looking at battery, but the only reason I'm showing you this is so you can compare it to what we were just working with before, or so that you can compare it to whatever drum machine you have that you're working with. I think the toughest thing in 2016, if you're getting into music production, is that you assume that every single plugin or every single instrument you load up is totally foreign and different to whatever it is you've just been working with. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And the point of this course is to help you be able to look at an instrument quickly and know what family it belongs to. So when I load up battery, this looks very similar to the drum machine we were just looking at, in that we have a lot of cells, and that by default right now, as I'm clicking my notes, I'm not hearing anything. And that's because we haven't populated this. In the case of battery, I can't drag and drop instruments in, but I can drag and drop samples in. So we're just going to use battery and set up some of the same things we did in the drum machine and talk about how this instrument goes a little bit further. Not going to just go through step by step all the different controls, because as long as you know the category of the instrument, you should have no problem kind of intuitively figuring out everything else that's going on inside of here. So I'm going to go and let's start by grabbing that kick drum we were working with before. Let's see if we can find it quickly. Here it is. So I drag it in and we can see that by default here it's put the key range to be C1. So if I play a C1, it's going to trigger that back. If I play any other note, it's not going to. If I bring this up to now C1 and D1, we can hear that it's playing it back identical. Inside of the drum machine, it was not easy for us to set up like a key tracking instrument where, let's imagine I want to play this kick, but I also want it to be tuning up as I go up this entire octave. I could very easily just copy and paste this cell all the way across, each time adjusting the tuning by just one single semitone. But it's even easier than that if I don't want to go through that manual hassle. That is something we could do inside of the drum machine. But here in battery, they make it very easy. I can just turn key tracking on, go back to my main page here, and now let's set this range to be an octave. But you'll notice again, we run into that issue that we ran into by default inside of Contact, and also the thing that we can't change with Bitwig samplers, and that is the speed of the playback. So as I go up the keyboard, it plays back faster, and you can see that. If I play lower, it goes back slower. But here we have these different key stretching algorithms that we can use, and these can even be used with just the one shot. They color the sound very differently, because right now we have just the standard sampler. We can turn on that like DFD mode. I don't really know what that stands for. It just seems to sound a little bit more accurate. So if I turn that off, maybe a little smoother. To be honest, I can't really tell a difference. Or we can go into a vintage mode where even if I'm just playing back the original, you can hear how it gets colored. And so it's tried to take the, quote unquote vibe of a couple of different hardware drum machines with different settings enabled. We also have the MPC60 down here at the bottom that we can work with. But in this case, let's go with standard, but let's see if we can adjust this so that we can get what we were getting in Contact, right? Where the playback, the speed is the same. And to do that, I just go into the stretch mode. So now in the stretch mode, and I actually like kind of staying in standard mode, because if you change the grain size, it actually gets you very different timbres. Like I kind of like it down low. And one other thing we can do, and this is something we'll talk about next week, is we can actually do more of like a wave scan type synthesis deal if I take the speed down really slow. And then let's go and put this key range up higher. Let's jump up an octave and listen to what happens. Let's actually go up even another octave. You can tell this is like a kid in the candy store. Or we can try the Pro mode, which just gives us the speed option. But interestingly enough, it's cutting off, and I'm not sure why that is. I wonder if I turn on this volume envelope, which is just going to be our classic ADSR, if I can get it to go through the whole sample. Nope. So I think I'm going to like standard for this. So it's just something cool that you can mess around with and experiment with. I'm not going to take that any farther. I just wanted to show you how this is pretty much what you're paying for. This is the extra. It's not difficult for us to set this up, put it into just the regular standard mode, and just play the sample back. Right? That's very easy. We also have things like pitch envelope, and to turn these things on, you just have to make sure that you enable them. I don't really need to worry about it because I just want the full sample playing back, and if I don't have the volume envelope turning on, that's what it's going to do. It's just going to play the whole thing back and then go to the end and stop. Very straightforward, very simple. Let's bring in a couple more sounds here. And let's look for that snare that was quite long. I'm looking for the longest snare I can find. So it looks like there's one that's 2 seconds. There's one that's a little... That one's got a nice reverb tail on it. So I'm going to grab that and bring it in onto D1. And then I'm going to grab a crash cymbal. Something that's a bit longer if I can find it. All of these are very short. So we can look in the 808, see if we can find something a little bit longer here. Okay, 4 seconds. Let's grab that. It's going to work out perfectly for us. So right now I could just play back my kit, just jamming along, you know. And if I want to go in here and adjust things like panning and the level, I can do that. Again, for each of these cells, everything you see is independent. The next thing I'll set up, since we set this up with the Bitwig drum machine, is more of like a choke group. And now inside of battery, they don't call it choke groups. It would be easy if I could just right click and have like choked by. That's not the way it works. I have to go into the setup here and set it up manually. And I'm also going to turn the key tracking off on that just so I don't get confused. But inside of the setup, let's say that I want the cymbal to cut off every time the kick hits. And in reality, we're also setting up the vice versa. So every time the kick hits and then the sample goes in, then the cymbal goes in, it's going to be cutting off the kick. But rarely do we have to worry about that because the kick is so quick. If we had something more like a lengthy sub and we wanted it to get cut off or not be cut off, we'd have to do things differently. But let's just do the easiest thing here. I'm going to create a new voice group. I'm going to rename this choke. And then I'm also going to set up the cymbal to go into that voice group. I'm going to leave the snare alone. So that should mean that every time I hit the cymbal and the snare, or every time I hit the kick and the snare, they'll both play back full length, okay, if there's overlapping. But what it did here with this group is by default, it put the voices down to 1. And that's just saying now that only one of these notes can really be triggering at any given time. So if the cymbal is going and then the kick hits, it's going to cut off. And we can even put on a little bit of a fade, which is really cool. Let's do a longer one so you can hear it. Okay, so you hear how that cymbal continues to ring out a little bit. Something along those lines if you want to set up or if you want it really exact. But you will notice that in this mode, like when I hit the kick, if I do it really quickly, it will cut the kick off, which you may not like, but very rarely is that going to be a problem for you. If it is, let me know and I'll show you a different way you could actually do this, where the kick should be able to ring out the full length. I haven't done it in a long time because I've never needed to, but I'm pretty sure it's possible. But that's one way to set up a very quick choke group. The last thing we're showing you, actually, I guess there's a couple things, is that with battery, what you're paying for when you buy a drum machine that's a dedicated drum machine is that each cell is giving you a world of options. Every single thing here is independent. So if I'm in the cymbal and I want to turn the filter on, I want to cut this off, the high end, I can do that, and it's not going to impact the snare. It's not going to impact the kick. I could instead put a low cut filter onto the kick or a low cut filter onto the snare. And then even if we take this a step further, we have a whole nother tab of effects where we can kind of move things around. And these are your most common standard effects that you use on one-shot drum samples. The first question people ask when they have battery is, how do I break these out so that I can use my own effects on these sounds? And it's like, no, that's not what you're paying for. Definitely work with and use these built-in effects if you're going to be using battery, if you've purchased battery. I don't recommend it one way or the other, but I'm just telling you, you're kind of not taking full potential of this instrument unless you do use the built-in effects, as well as some of the built-in like grouping options and things like that. Because if we go to the master, this is where we can now affect the entire kit. So if we wanted to, for example, saturate everything the same way, we could do that. So you can hear how those are all going through the saturator, like so. And there's different versions and modes that you have, so just things to experiment with on your own. We also have a compressor, so if we had our full kit going in here, we could use the solid bus compressor, and we actually have a bunch of different compressors. We have the, I guess this is for side chaining. If you needed to set up a side chain, you could do it. The classic, pro, and of course then more of the SSL style compression, which is going to have fixed settings here. Not something worth going over in this course, but just thought I would reference it to you. We also have reverb and delay sends that are set up by default. So if I go into my main setting here on the kick, I can send this into the reverb, which doesn't sound particularly good. So let's send the snare into it. And then on the master, we can go and we can adjust the settings here for the reverb. Interestingly, this reverb does not give us any presets, whereas all of the other effects will give us presets by default if we want to go in and just very quickly load something up and see how it fits. This one we would have to set up completely manually, and then we could adjust how much we send into those. So if I want to send a little bit of delay into the kick, I could do that, and then also send some delay from the snare. And this is just purely a theoretical example. So last but not least, if you do want to break these out onto individual tracks, it is possible, but you will have to consult your DAW's documentation. Inside of this instrument, it is very, very simple to do that, okay? I can right-click on this, and I can choose what output I want to send this out to. And by default, it's giving me stereo pairs here. I believe it is possible in the preferences to set this up to go mono as well. So if your sounds are mono, which most of them are probably going to be if they're drum samples, you could have even more options to break things out to. But since we only have 3, let's just keep it in stereo pairs for right now, especially if for some reason we had to add a stereo effect to something, right? We wouldn't want to break that out in mono if the track itself is not stereo, just as an FYI to people. Sometimes they forget that. But if I go in here, I could go ahead and say, all right, I want this output to not go to the master, which is actually 1 and 2, but let's send it out to 3 and 4. Let's send the snare out to 5 and 6. And let's send the cymbal out to 7 and 8. So if I try to play back sounds now, the only thing that we're hearing is the output of the reverb, which is still going out onto 1 and 2, which is currently what's set up. But if I turn that off, we're not going to hear anything, okay? And that's because I need to now set it up inside of my DAW. So depending on your DAW, you'll do this a different way. Here, it's very easy. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to add chains, and it's just going to add them in order. So it's added me 1 and 2. Now it's added me 3 and 4, and this is going to be our kick. This would actually be our sends if we had reverb and delay. This would be the snare. And again, these numbers are just corresponding to what I just set up. And this is going to be the crash. Okay, so now if I play back, and again, I have now parameters like volume, panning, I can solo, I can mute them, and that's going to be different to what I set up here. Okay, so if I adjust the volume from this is a whole nother volume control right here. They're not going to correspond. But the benefit now is if I wanted, I could again go in, I could open this up, and I could then add individual effects here to each of these. Okay, something I could definitely do if I wanted. And just as a reminder, if I was in there again and I had my sends going, sorry. Let's put this into the reverb. We can see how that is now coming out onto 1 and 2 because by default, those are your master outputs. All right, so that's battery in a nutshell. There's a lot more you can do with this. You definitely want to go into the editor here. You get a lot more options in terms of manipulating your waveform, similar to the options you have in Contact, only the display is a little bit more user-friendly, and you can actually drag in multiple samples here and do layering, stuff like that. And like I said before, this is what you're paying for, but fundamentally, this is just another drum machine, okay? A drum machine with some extra bells and whistles. So thanks for the attention, and we're going to be wrapping up this section in the next video.